Hi, and welcome back to another video that lets you read the Tanakh or the Old Testament in the original Hebrew, even if you do not speak a word of the language. My name is Ilan, and I am a native Hebrew speaker. My role here is to guide you through the authentic text and make it as accessible to you non-speakers as possible. We are now in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. If you've watched my previous video, you might recall that in order to keep each episode as bite-sized as possible, I decided to split the reading of this longish verse into two installments. We covered the first sentence in my last video, and now it's time for the second one. The sentence in Hebrew reads as follows: Ruach Elohim Merakhefet al pnei hamayim. Let's go over each of the Hebrew words and see what we can learn. The sentence starts with the word veruach, which has a prefix attached to it, ve. As discussed in past videos, ve is the Hebrew equivalent of the English conjunction and. The word ruach can be translated into two main words in English. The most common meaning is wind. So haruach noshevet means the wind is blowing, and energiat ruach is wind energy. However, that same word ruach also means spirit. So team spirit is ruach tzevet. As to spirits of dead people, this meaning exists in modern Hebrew. However, ruach as a ghost is nowhere to be found in the Tanakh or the Old Testament. Meanwhile, Ruach does refer to the opposite of the tangible and bodily, and by extension in modern Hebrew, Ruchani is spiritual. Here is Ruach serving as the root, and Ruchaniut is spirituality. Ruach appears in the Bible more than 350 times as both wind and spirit. For example, in 1 Kings 18:45, Ruach is used to describe wind as a weather phenomenon, nothing spiritual. Given that Ruach has a dual meaning, the Hebrew Bible seems to look at wind and spirit as strongly related, even interchangeable. In Genesis 7:15, animals came to Noah's Ark, all of them with a breath of life. Breath, like wind, involves the movement of air when inhaled and exhaled, but this can be also read metaphorically as spirit of life. So Genesis 7:15 might be the point where the two meanings of Ruach, wind and spirit, merge. In other places, Ruach is getting into and out from people or rests upon them, affecting their emotional, cognitive, or mental state, like in Numbers 5:30. Since Ruach can be wind, this might hint to some kind of motion that is involved when talking about the Spirit of God in Hebrew. The next word is Elohim, which means God. This is the second time in the Bible where he is mentioned, and we've covered this important word in the first video of this channel. As we noted there, the Hebrew word Elohim is in the plural, but it doesn't mean that the Bible talks about several gods, but rather that it refers to the one God in a respectful manner. The third word is Merakhefet. This is the verb of the sentence. Merakhefet is yet another case where translators had no other choice but to actively interpret the text because they could not be sure what the precise meaning was. There are only two other places in the Bible where variants of this word appear. One of them is Jeremiah 23:9. The relevant word here is rachafu, which shares the same root as Merakhefet in Genesis 1:2. The letters of the root are reish, which is similar to R but more in a French style, at least in modern pronunciation, r. Then there is chet, which we have covered last time in detail, and pei, which can sound like both F and P in European languages. Here it sounds like an F. English translations understand rachafu as shake or tremble, i.e., the prophet trembled due to his mental condition, seeing the moral corruption in Jerusalem and Judea. Using context, this translation is plausible, yet I don't think that the Spirit of God, or Ruach Elohim in Genesis 1:2, was shaking or trembling upon the water. Or was it? We don't really know for sure what metaphorically happened to the bones of the prophet in this verse, but whatever this was, it doesn't look serene and peaceful. To me, based on Merakhefet in Jeremiah, the Spirit of God could have moved more forcefully than in the picture that many people paint in their minds. The only other place in the Bible where this root is used is Deuteronomy 32:11. The word of interest is highlighted and sounds Merakhefet. Looking only on the part of this verse that is relevant to our purposes, this is again the root. You might have noticed that the last letter of the root is different here. This is because Pei is one of the 5 letters in Hebrew that change when they appear at the end of words. I'll talk about this more in future episodes. There's a visual clue though that can link for you the 2 forms of the letter. Pei is the only one in the alphabet that kind of folds into itself. The difference between the normal and the terminal forms is that the lower stroke goes from horizontal to vertical, respectively. Back to the verse in Deuteronomy, the translation of Merakhefet in the King James Version is fluttereth. It suggests that the bird mentioned is fluttering, and this is echoed in some other English versions. Here again, it doesn't seem logical that the Spirit of God in the story of the creation fluttered upon the water. That is unless we rely on the previous verse in Jeremiah, which points to a more restless motion, if you will, of the Spirit of God. However, this verse in Deuteronomy talks about a bird called in Hebrew nesher, which is most probably a vulture, but might be an eagle. Large birds of prey like vultures and eagles, at least in Israel and the region in general, don't tend to flutter, but more to glide on hot air vortices. Vultures and eagles might stay in place mid-air, but with their wings spread out wide. Fluttering is probably a feature of smaller birds, hovering by rapidly flapping their wings. What is the meaning of Merakhefet then? After all, we are here in Deuteronomy because we want to understand Merakhefet in Genesis 1:2, aren't we? So instead of flutter, there is another option, to hover. This is how Hebrew speakers understand both Merakhefet and Merakhefet. This is shared by some of the newer English versions. And since Hebrew speakers overwhelmingly see Merakhefet as hovering, this ancient root, Reish, Chet, Pei, has been used to create some related modern terminology and expressions. Here are a few notable examples. You can say about a female astronaut that she is Merakhefet bechalal, hovering or floating in space. This is actually the very same word as in Genesis 1:2. Understanding the word in Genesis as hovering also inspired the term Merakhefet, hovercraft. Do you see the highlighted letters of the root? And the sound of the words is almost identical. Merakhefet versus Merakhefet. There is also Matzneach Rechifa, a paraglider. And lastly, Rachfan, a drone. So you in English call this flying device based on the sound it makes, and we in Israel call it based on the fact that it hovers. I personally think it's neat that many terms in Hebrew for cutting-edge technology are directly linked back to this old text of the Bible. However, please note that this verse in Deuteronomy is extremely poetic, and the original Hebrew is particularly difficult to decipher. It's not just the word Merakhef, but other parts as well. So with that in mind, it is possible to also consider a different interpretation of Merakhef in Deuteronomy and Merakhefet in Genesis. As the verse in Deuteronomy talks about a nest, it might actually refer to the vulture or eagle using the large wings to shield or cover its young from the elements, holding the wings very close, almost touching the chicks. A few scholars, Jewish at least, read Merakhef this way because this verse is an allegory about how God will protect the people of Israel, his children, like a majestic bird would. Another point I would like to make about Merakhefet is the fact that it's a feminine verb, and that is because the noun Ruach, i.e. wind or spirit, is feminine too. So God is masculine, but God's wind or spirit is feminine. And on top of that, Merakhefet is in the present tense, unlike all other verbs in this first chapter of the Bible. Accordingly, the right way to translate this sentence would be, and the Spirit of God hovers, or covers, or moves, or flutters, etc. upon the water. Despite that, Merakhefet in all English translations I've come across is in the past tense. Also, in terms of visuals, while the word Ruach might suggest motion like wind, as we've discussed earlier, Merakhefet can imply hovering in place without motion. English translations understand Merakhefet as moved, but as we've just seen, this is far from being certain. We basically don't know what Merakhefet actually means. We've covered already the first three words of the sentence. Ruach Elohim Merakhefet. The next two words are a pair, and we have encountered them in the previous sentence of the verse in my last video, al pnei. If you could recognize them, then well done. Remember, you might not have seen a single letter of Hebrew just a short while ago. If this expression didn't look familiar, it's okay. Learning takes time and repeated exposure, like watching all my videos and better still, more than once. Just as a quick reminder, the unit al pnei means upon, and as we've said last time, the words the face of that appear in most translations are all but redundant. You can go to that video and check why that is. So, in my mind, given the translation of al pnei as upon, this might suggest that the moving or hovering of Ruach Elohim was very close to the water. Which brings us to the last word, hamayim, the water. The first letter is hey, a prefix equivalent to the in English. Note that maim is another word in Hebrew that always comes in plural, similarly to shamayim or sky, which we have already discussed in verse 1. So we say in Hebrew maim karim, cold water. Can you find the suffix for the masculine plural? Here it is, in both the noun and the adjective. It follows then that in Hebrew we literally say in all types of usage something like cold waters. Anyway, water is never singular in our language. One last thing about Maim, the given name of the actress and TV personality Maim Bialik is actually this Hebrew word, meaning, as we've seen, water. The fact that she has a Hebrew word as her name might not be a coincidence. She is related to the late author Chaim Nachman Bialik, who is considered as Israel's national poet and has contributed several important new words during the revival of Hebrew as a modern language, such as the words for camera or background, strongly relying on the Bible and other ancient sources. Okay, now that we've covered all words in this sentence and taken together the two parts of this second verse, in terms of visuals, we can have several options. The possible scenes I'm seeing in my mind following the research for this video is of a dark, endless ocean with the Spirit of God moving across it or staying still hovering, but just above the surface of the water. And if we follow the interpretation of Merakhefet as shielding or covering, we might even imagine the Spirit of God as sort of an invisible blanket of fog covering and barely touching the water. There is also a more dynamic option for the motion of Ruach Elohim based on the translation of a related word as trembled. Let's now read the verse one more time in Hebrew, this time with both parts. והארץ הייתה תוהו ובוהו וחושך על פני תהום, ורוח אלוהים מרחפת על פני המים. In my next video, we will read the third verse of the Bible. As a heads up, there is a lot of difference between the Hebrew and the English, not so much in terms of meaning, but more relating to style and structure. In other words, a lot of the aesthetics of the Hebrew verse is being lost in the English versions. I think it's worth exploring, so please join me there. Until then, please like, share, subscribe, and select all in the notification bell to be able to continue this journey we have just recently begun. If you're new here, please consider clicking on the link here to explore earlier episodes using a playlist. Thank you for watching and see you next time.